have on workplace learning and development? That's our opening question for the audience here already. Now look, Ulrik, just scanning the answers already. Bethan says huge. Please put your answers in that big box underneath. But look at all these answers that are coming in. It's a combination of fear and excitement. Beth says huge. Mark loves the potential. Alice says time savers, going to change everything, says Claire. But Emma says unemployment. Rebecca says scary. Huge potential, says Kinga. A lot of unknowns. No more writers, says Octavia. Ulrik, do you agree with that? Will there be no more writers?
No, I don't agree with that. But I think the writing process will be different.
Okay, it's still there, but different. Right. Lazy companies might revert to AI-built learning with copy and paste, says Vanessa. I share your fears on that one, Vanessa. Josh says it's going to change everything. Game changer, Claire agrees. Disruption, says Ulf. Massive time saver. We've had time saver coming up a couple of times. Leon mentions that. Ulrik, where will it save time? Where will work change with that, with what we're doing?
So I think there are some pretty obvious ones that everybody can see, that we don't need a lot of copy editors anymore. We, like, the same way as we don't have people like where their full-time job is doing typewriting. We don't, like, that kind of changes will happen, and there will be substantial time savings in that. What's much more interesting is what will happen in the more sophisticated usages of this, and particularly related to education. I think there are so many other areas where you quickly need to catch up. If you're working in the financial sector, you quickly need to catch up on an industry or something. That is a total game changer. It's the same kind of breakthrough as when you got Google search, but just the next generation after that. But in education, we will come back to that. It's a surprising area where I actually think the big impact will be.
There's a really interesting balance of answers here, Ulrik. I think this combination of excitement, but also fear. The word potential is coming up a lot. Catherine says very important. Dehumanization of experience, says Roger, which I think is an interesting way of putting it. I think Mark's interesting. Changes in roles, not just a reduction in roles. But I think Anders really sums it up for me. It depends on how you use it. Yeah, I think it probably does. Thank you for all these comments. Land of opportunity, says Vince. I love that. Time saver. A lot of people talking about time saving, but I think we've moved on a lot. Actually, Andrew, Andrew Jacobs, who very often runs these events, he's done a quick word cloud summary in the background for us. The words that are coming out are game changer, transformative, opportunity, potential, and content. So people are seeing this as a positive thing. And I think we've gone through the first 3 to 6 months of being slightly bewildered after ChatGPT launched at the end of November last year. And I now think people are pretty mature in their assessment of it, but we're still a bit unsure about what the opportunities are. Leor says it's a chance to outsource some of the grunt work meaning some of the hard but uninteresting work, and focus on the human high-touch stuff. At least that's the theory. It might not play out that way. All right. Gosh. I love hanging out with you guys because we get so much feedback and input and thinking here. It's great. Thank you so much for that. Right. We're going to press on now with the discussion now with me and Ulrik talking about what we think is going to happen. I'm going to move on from this layout in a minute. So that box where everyone's written their great ideas is going to shut down in a minute. And by the way, I'm going to take this, I'm going to make a blog out of it in the future because there's so much value there. So stop typing there. Please shift your typing over to the right-hand side. Now, if you've got any questions, you've got a big box there underneath Ulrik's lovely face, and you can put your questions in there for Ulrik. We'll come into the questions at the end in about 50 minutes or so, 40 minutes now. Thank you very much for all that input. Ulrik, let's define some terms. We say AI. We said AI in December last year. Everyone thought ChatGPT, but it's been around for much longer than a few months. Tell us about, very quickly, some of the background that we need to have to understand AI in general, not just generative AI.
Well, so I think it's worthwhile to just pause for a second and say there are many other species of AI out there that are pervasive. Like, you use a different kind of AI to do complex pattern recognition. You use different kinds of AI to drive very domain-specific things. And in education, we have used super specialized niche kinds of AI for instance, run personalized systems for well over a decade, almost 15 years now. And you can use, so it depends a little bit on exactly how you define it, but in the broadest term, and some of the public definitions now, the regulatory definitions, almost any kind of statistics are now AI, which is probably a little bit too broad. But even if you get closer to when the computers behave intelligently, that is much broader than just language models, and I think it's necessary. And I think, just to maybe show an example of it, a language model would be able to explain something, but you need another kind of AI to sequence it over a longer period of time. Like, so, and that's the same thing as where having Google search available means you can do research way faster, but you still need something to put glue between the different research points you find. If you're making a report, or if you're writing something, you're trying to understand something, Google search for sure totally changed the landscape of that. Where you, like, when I went to university started university in the early 90s, we still went to libraries and pulled books down the shelves. Of course, that is being sped up, and you'll see a similar improvement of acceleration when you move from just having Google search to having language models. But you still need something that is the kind of glue that is between them. And there are huge weaknesses still of these models. It's not that they solve all problems. So it's a little bit like we've suddenly gotten power tools, but we still need screwdrivers and
It's a
many
really
others.
good analogy, a really good way of putting it. And of course, AI as a term was actually coined, I think, in 1956 at the Dartmouth workshop, when a bunch of actually white men got together over a period of about 8 weeks and just had a brainstorming session for 8 weeks about it, and those thoughts came out of it. A lot of great stuff come out in the general chat and observation here. Andrew, any particularly pertinent stuff? I've already put some stuff over to the questions box for Ulrik at the end. We're talking particularly about bias there, also about dealing with facts that sound credible but aren't really facts at all. These are concerns about that people have. So thank you. Andrew's on top of that. This is, when you're doing one of these webinars, you've got nearly 400 people in a room. You need to have at least 2 people doing that job. We also, I should say, have Niels also from Area 9, who's going to drop in with any thoughts into the chat as well. But I just got to say, I love Leo's comment. I've had awful experiences with humans as well, says Leo. So it is a point. It's not just AI that can be rude and bad. All right, we've got large language models. We have ChatGPT. GPT standing, of course, generative pre-trained transformer. Just very quickly, Ulrik, before we go into any more conversation about what I'd like to talk about, what AI gets wrong. Before we do that, can you just describe to us large language models that are general and which are domain specific? Because I think this is pretty important for how people might use AI for learning.
Well, so in nature, those large language models are very general. They basically read everything there is to read publicly available in the world, and understood it to a certain extent. What is interesting, of course, is how do you ask the questions to somebody who has that perfect knowledge of everything? Because the answer will depend on which questions you're asking. And that's what a lot of people have now learned a new term this year, which is prompt engineering. Very few people knew what prompt engineering was at Christmas, right? And that in plain English means, how do you ask the right questions? How do you then over time become good at asking the right questions? And that is going to open up a completely new industry of companies and research areas where you're getting good at that in specific domains. And as an example, right now, if you try to define something by saying what it's not, it's really still really bad at it. And it's been bad at this from the first generations of this. So you have to find a way to exclude something. It's very bad at excluding things. It used to be really bad at math. It's getting better. So there are lots of limitations to what these models can do, and it's becoming clearer and clearer that building super technologies on top of them that are more domain specific, that are able to get out of them what we, for instance, need in education, is going to be a completely new world. So it's going to be a combination between general technologies and domain-specific technologies, still in the large language model domain, because there are also domain-specific models and domain-specific education technologies that are AI technologies that have nothing to do with large language models.
Again, it's not just about generative stuff. It's not just about LLMs. There is more to it than that. Let's talk then briefly about what but actually, you mentioned there that we're already using AI, or you've been using it for 15 years. I know you've got a great case study, a great example of that with medical care in the US. Could you just tell us about that?
So we have it's been used by tens of millions of people in the past. These adaptive sequences. Basically, you're using an intelligent behavior of a computer to be able to analyze how and understand how an individual is learning. So it's the same thing as you do in healthcare, where you do precision medicine, or actually even just basic diagnostics, where each patient gets treated as an individual, as opposed to in education, where we often treat cohorts, or we deal with cohorts of classes or groups, or even larger at lectures, where it's 300 people who are the recipient of it. So I think those technologies have basically become the state of the art in higher education and other areas where knowledge acquisition is the prime job.
Mm.
It has grown into K-12 in one end, and it is rapidly growing into the high risk areas in the corporate world, because one of the impacts of it is that it's highly reliable when you use these things. The downside is that it costs money to produce the content for these things, and I think we'll come back to that a lot in the rest of this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, Scott asked the question, is K-12 high school? K-12 stands for kindergarten through to year 12 in the US, which is it's the end of high school, isn't it? So it's basically the children's educational system in the US. Thanks for raising it. And Scott, love your point about AI being more than just generative AI. And you've got a good example there in the box on the right. Thank you for that. How do you think? I want to look in a bit more detail at adaptive learning in just a second, because that's where your particular area of expertise is. And I think it's an area where I think people aren't aware just of how much work has already happened with adaptive learning and delivery. I would love to quickly, though, talk about very quickly ways in which you think that learning development will be affected by AI that possibly we haven't already considered. I've got, of course, my favorite list of subjects, but is there anything particular you think, Don, we've got to talk about X because this is something where people aren't aware that AI is going to change what we're doing in L&D?
So a lot of the public conversation about AI in education is that we'll have these robotic teachers that are able to just take you to wherever you want to go.
Right.
And honestly, we had a serious conversation in our leadership team half a year ago whether that would be reality or not, and we were not sure actually. And we have been using these models and working with them since the very early versions of this. And it's becoming clearer and clearer now that that's not going to happen for a couple of reasons. One of them is what several have brought up in the chat as well, that there's a huge risk of both bias and that they're not reliable, and there will be lots of regulatory constraints put around these models, same as we have with gene modified compounds and organisms and stuff like that. I think we're going to see heavy regulation in the field that will limit a lot of these George Orwell 1984 kind of perspectives. So I don't think I'm not particularly interested even in those areas. What is interesting is where could you see enormous breakthroughs? And the biggest one I see is that if you look at the amount of money, of all the money that is invested in education at all levels, most of that money goes into producing content of some kind. And content in the broadest sense, content meaning a teacher teaching from in front of a whiteboard to a group of students. So any kind of processing and communicating knowledge, that's the vast majority of the investment, and that can be impacted, particularly because we will be able to produce high quality content and recreate content in different ways that we've not been able to before. It's been by far the biggest obstacle and friction for people moving more aggressively towards these personalized systems. It's not that somebody says, no, I really want to be treated like the 30 other people taking this class. I've never heard anybody say that, but I've heard a lot of people say, but it's not worth it to move towards something that is more expensive because I can still get some basic stuff out of this. And that means that you can completely flip this upside down if you're able to say, in a traditional educational environment, we sacrifice parts of a population of learners, saying Because this is a fixed model. This is an off-the-peg model that is going to fit some people. There are some people it doesn't fit. And we all know that. You walk into a clothing store and they only have certain models, and there will definitely be people who can't fit the off-the-peg clothes. It's much worse in education because we are probably like, where in terms of weight, we can be 3 times difference from the lightest to the heaviest, whereas in terms of education, it's probably like 50 times difference. 25 for the normal population, maybe. But what if you could suddenly flip it upside down and say, what if the given now was that everybody got to full proficiency and we were able to put clothes on everybody? The difference was how long it takes. And that's a very, very different, that's a huge impact, because that will also change. Are we going to have a selection based on learning speed, for instance? Or are there actually people who can meet some of the new requirements in a modern world? They're just a little bit slower to learn some kinds of knowledge, because that's been the kind of yardstick we've had in the past. If you could pick up knowledge fast, you could move faster in life. But that's not necessarily the yardstick in the future anymore.
I love that point, and we're going to look more into this about how we can generate content and use it really well in that adaptive way in a second. I've also, of course, been, while listening, also been reading the chat and the questions. Great questions coming in. We are going to deal with regulation. We need to get one thing out of the way before we go forward, Ulrik. People are asking, what's in the glass box behind you? I don't think it is actually a glass box, is it?
It's a fancy hotel room where they decided to put some kind of a frame around the bed.
There we are. So I would love to say it's the potent power of AI being unleashed in that glass cage. It's just a fancy hotel room. And fair play to Ulrik, and thank you. He's flown into Copenhagen. He's gone straight to his hotel, got himself set up, and thank him very much for getting an earlier flight so he could be with us today. Also on the right-hand side, we've got general chat and observations, and there are. I love the specific examples of what people are doing. Polly talking about how to do some very specific stuff at work. Please keep dropping those examples in, because that's really helpful for everybody to generate useful stuff from each other. Okay, just very quickly, my 2 cents on what I think the 3 things that are going to be revolutionized for L&D unexpectedly by AI. Yes, content, but I think personalization and adaptive learning, the idea that we can understand what people are doing and react to them in real time while they're trying to learn something, is, I think, going to be absolutely crucial and essential part of what we do in the future. It means that learning and development is going to shift from a focus on content creation to helping people learn. Doesn't mean content creation isn't still important, but our focus will be on helping people learn. I think that's going to be a huge shift. Talk about that more at the end, possibly. I think surfacing tacit knowledge, we're not going to talk about that today, but I think understanding in organizations where hotbeds of, so this is both organizational networking and understanding where knowledge is, finding that out and then surfacing it is a very powerful use of AI that we're not talking about at the moment with L&D. Finally, coaching. A lot of people know that this can be done. I've seen an awful lot of examples in various different ways that are effectively doing adaptive learning, but it's not content focused. It's focused on Q&A and responding to the individual, and that's also going to be enormous for the future. But all that aside, let's have a look at adaptive learning and how we can get that to get people to competence faster. I think that's the short phrase of it. Gosh, there's so much going on here. Andrew, very quickly, before I go any further, is there anything which we've missed in the questions or the chat which I should be responding to? Or are we good?
No, there's some really interesting, the conversation is fascinating. We picked up some questions which we'll pick up later: plagiarism, ethics, regulation, governance, inclusion, including neurodivergence, how to use large language models, LLMs and ChatGPT and so on effectively in the future, and how should we be asking questions and being able to use them. But no, the conversation, I tell you, there's smart people in these rooms.
There's smart people in the room. That's what we love. I've just seen Richard Williams asking about assessment. Could you move that over to the questions for the end? It's obviously an important one. Yeah, I do love getting together with this group. Honestly, thank you very much, everyone, for coming and bringing your smarts to this conversation. On the slide here, look, this is my very simple image of a path to proficiency. You start at one end, you're not proficient. You want to finish being proficient. Ideally, you'd like it to be a straight line, all right? But it never quite works out that way, because when we are generating courses, content, inevitably there's this sense that, well, it's not just for one person. We have to create content for everybody. It's really important to make sure that we do effectively one size fits all. It's going to be a tool that doesn't take you straight start to finish, but rather we're going to zigzag a bit. We're going to pick up different bits of information from different parts of the way. Now, if somebody took me on a guided tour of London, where I live, I'd say, look, I'd like to see St. Paul's. I don't want to see Westfield Shopping Centre. I actually live quite close to that, and it's not interesting for me. And I don't need to see Big Ben. But on a guided tour, I have to go to all of these places because that's where the guided tour takes you. Courses in the past have been a bit like a guided tour, taking you to places where you've got to go to because, well, that's where the tour goes. Everyone follows the same slightly suboptimal route. It's different when you start adapting your content to the individual as you go through it. And that's where my competence runs out. But I'm going to hand it over to Ulrik to pick up the conversation, take us through what does this mean. Ulrik, you see the next button there. If you click on that, there we go. Take us away. Take it away, Ulrik.
Yeah, and maybe for the context for why this is important, it's because I'm going to make the point later that the big breakthrough for large language models is it allows you to do this at scale. And that's been the big reason why it hasn't happened faster in certain areas. So just to level
at scale, so you could do it faster and also cheaper, yeah.
At an enormous scale. Like the last few people I've shown what I'm going to show you later, they said that their heads exploded. So that's a cliffhanger. So just to level set here, what do we mean when we talk about adaptive learning? So you could basically say that there are two kinds of learning: linear learning and non-linear learning. And when it comes to knowledge acquisition, like adaptive learning has been the prevalent, the predominant answer to how to do non-linear learning. How do we get computers to help? Particularly on computers, by the way, it is the situation where we're trying to get personal environments on your computer, on your laptop, on your phone to behave more like you had a tutor next to you. Because of course, if you had all the money in the world and you could hire the best personal tutor, best personal teacher, that's also non-linear, of course, and that's what we are striving towards, because that's what science has shown is so far the most optimal situation we've been able to find. For this kind of learning. And I'm not blind to the fact that there are other kinds of learning where group interaction and interpersonal stuff is also super, super important. But for now, we're talking about the what usually has dominated almost any kind of education, except for a little bit of executive training. And I know that there are some companies that are doing much more than just on the fringes. But if you look across all corporate education in the world, 90% plus, I would say easily, has been knowledge focused. And I think that knowledge will also play an important role in the future. This is a big debate. Is because we have these things, is knowledge going to go away? I'm writing a book with Tony Wagner now, who used to say that because you had Google, you don't need to learn knowledge anymore. And he has totally abandoned that late. And he's like, oh, of course, I completely agree. It's the human's ability in the future is the ability to zoom out, zoom in, quickly move, associatively, all these kinds of things. And in order to be able to do that efficiently, it's not enough you have to go through Google first or go through ChatGPT. You need to be able to master a whole lot of content despite this. So if this is adaptive learning, it adjusts real time. It's able to basically sense where you are and then decide, lay the tracks in front of you. Not too dissimilar for how the large language models are deciding what is the next word. What should the next word be? For those of you who haven't read up on how the large language model actually works, it's pretty fascinating. It's a statistical model who says the highest probability, let me pick the next word that has the highest probability that it fits in here. We do the same with some of these other intelligent models where we say, what is the next thing we can suggest somebody to do, like in a micro level? What is the next small step that is the most likely and the highest impact step we can choose to do? But it's not a large language model that does it. It's a specific model made for adaptive learning. Wow, the arrow actually worked. That was a mistake, but it worked. So When we study learners, and we've had the luxury of studying like dozens of millions of learners at all age groups, at all levels of proficiency, we typically find this pattern that they're learning the same thing. Like you cannot recognize one learner from the other. The differences are vast. The differences in terms of time to proficiency is enormous. We often see 8 to 10x difference between the fastest and the slowest learners that can eventually get to proficiency. So when you turn this thing on its head, saying now the given is everybody gets to full proficiency, the variable is how long it takes, you suddenly begin to see some pretty shocking results that if we just waited a little bit longer, a lot more people could get fully proficient. It's not a matter of people being dumb or not dumb. One of the most important things is just what style of learning happens. And you cannot even tell that the faster learners are the ones who will have longer retention or performance over time. It's not that simple. In some ways, you could also compare it to a traditional map where in the traditional linear way, you have a map way that takes you from A to B and you can make a route and you follow that. Whereas if you look at the nonlinear or adaptive systems, they're able to measure where you are and help course correcting, and you decide where you want to go, as opposed to the London tour bus that Don mentioned. So if this is kind of like the basic of what adaptive learning is compared to linear learning or classroom-based learning, so it's in some ways you could call it like e-learning on steroids. It is on computers, not to confuse it with what great teachers can do, but the promise here is that you can get some of that knowledge acquisition out of the way, so you can focus on the things that are new requirements. Where it's not enough to just know things in the future. You also need to be able to do something with it. So learning that works will be redefined, and learning that matters will be redefined. It was enough to make it matter to be able to memorize a lot of things 40 years ago, but it won't anymore. And that means that we still need to do something about it, particularly if I'm right about my prediction, which is we probably need to learn more substance matter in the future than less. And we need to learn how to use it even more aggressively as humans.
Amy Burval, who's a very creative educator, says you can't join the dots if you don't have the dots. And I think that's what the human mind does very well in a way that computers can't, is make unexpected connections between things, but you can't make unexpected connections between things that you have to search for. They have to be in your head already. That's why we need to know things. I would love to have a discussion with you and Tony about that over a drink sometime. Ulrik, let's talk then about this. You're generating a course at the moment. We had a discussion about this earlier in the week. You're generating a course at the moment on project management. Is that right? Can you talk us through how you'd be creating that? And then we'll have a look at Mindflow as a tool for doing that.
Yeah, so the situation was like just a few days ago, one of our large corporate clients came to us and said, we really need adaptive learning for project management for IT integrations. We don't know where to start.
Right.
And
this is very specific. Project management for IT integrations.
Yes. And then the thing is, this is where if you're a traditional publisher, so this is interesting because this technology that I'm going to show you in a second called Mindflow is basically taking the expertise in publishing, the expertise in education, all the research that we have been able to find over the last 25 years and put it into domain-specific technology. So think of the process. If somebody came to a publisher back in the days and said, there is a big need for a book about project management for IT integrations, what would that publisher do? The publisher would say, yeah, we would try to source an author, and full disclosure, I used to be part of the executive team of one of the largest publishers in the world. So we would find somebody who was a subject matter expert in this. We would go out and look at all the competing books in the market to come up with, here's the rough structure. We would, and sometimes even like cut the spine off them and put them out on a big table to try to figure out what fits where. Could we come up with a different way to do it? But we would typically start with what is the lay of the land. And this is where the large language models are amazing, but it's not enough to just ask one question. Typically, you have to go back and forth in many, many iterations. So what Mindflow does is it talks to GPT-4 behind the scenes. It can use any kind of large language model. We know that they are being improved super fast. But what is interesting is that if you use these things, you are able to come up with a first cut that is surprisingly good.
Right.
And if you allow me to share, I can maybe show what comes
let me
out.
bring up the screen share. So you're
So
talking
I'm going.
about you're talking about using this tool you're going to show us to work through a combination of tools to produce the first cut of a course. We'll talk in a minute about how long that would otherwise take to create. I'll shut up and let you just show this tool, and you can describe what's going on here. Do it in a bit of detail, because it may be that it's difficult to understand exactly what's going on.
So the only thing we've done here is we've said that the audience are project managers in a pharmaceutical company, and I've given it a parameter, I can't show it right here, to say what is roughly the length of the investment that people are willing to spend here. So the scope has been defined. I think I defined this as a 4-day course, and this is unaltered. So the thing here is, this is also a technology where, like, of course, it would be way more qualified if I then begin to say I am actually a subject matter expert and I want to do this one, but not this one. I add a couple more before it moves on. But this is what MindFlow in combination with.
Just one second, Ulrik. Sorry. Amanda is saying, can you zoom in on the screen a bit? The model's hard to see. If you go to the top right-hand corner to see more of what's going on, you should see at the top of the screen. I think it's there's like a filled-in rectangle. Not you, Ulrik, but anybody who's watching. A filled-in rectangle with things around it. There, Joe says, click 100. Thank you, Joe. That makes life a lot easier. Good to have an expert in the room, Joe. Thank goodness you're there. Ulrik, back to you.
So, so this is unaltered. The big power of this is, of course, when you use it in combination with people who knows what they're doing. But already at these first cuts, and I've done it in medicine, I've done it in history, I've done it in literature, and this one we just run to say, could we just come up with a first cut? We're actually sending this over to this client later today, saying at least here's some inspiration, and we let it run overnight, talking thousands of interactions back and forth between MindFlow and GPT-4, using everything curated and with the way, basically using the mindset of a good publisher, a good editor, all a good educator, all these different things that would normally go into an editorial process for figuring out what should be in here. And what it has done is it has written, so this would be the scope and sequence. You can see it's actually pretty deep. And without being a domain expert, I would say this looks pretty reasonable. And if you pick an area, it has even, and you can see here, it has even written the ebook section that applies to this. It has linked it, it has highlighted the important keywords so you can use skimming techniques for reading it. It has linked it to the underlying learning objectives that it also actually has mapped itself. So it's our MindFlow technology combined with GPT-4 has been able to decompose what it actually has written itself back to learning objectives, which is a process we normally use learning engineers for. And what it has then done is it has analyzed what would be good assessment items to do the closed loop on whether people have understood it. And it has even generated redundant questions, including remediation content for the distractors that have also been generating. And if anybody has tried to do this process by hand, you will know that the amount of work it takes to build this amount of content is probably a couple of person years just to get a first.
I'm laughing because I remember writing multiple choice questions for Microsoft back in the 1990s, and it was a nightmare. Just to recap what's happened here, you put a prompt in, given a scope in terms of the audience, the aim, the rough length of time. MindFlow has gone through an iterative process, an editorial process, going to ChatGPT, constructing, coming back without you doing anything to it, going backwards and forwards to create this. How close do you think this is to the finished article of the course you want?
So I'm not a domain expert here, but we've done it in medicine, where you are within, you need to change 2% of what comes out. Like, it's that good. Like, it is incredibly good. Of course, they could be special. If you go to super specialized areas, they will have to change more. But as an example, I'm working on a project right now where they want to count everything in bar rather than PSI or HEA. And then you just make custom instructions across all of this and say, by the way, please refer to pressure always in bar. And then it does across the entire, like this is for an entire organization.
Is
But
that
also,
something to do with diving, Ulrik?
could be these guys. Don knows that that's my big passion, and also my test bed and laboratory for figuring out how do people not die. But also look at this. It's been able to analyze that it would be great to use a categorized probe for exemplifying applications of different types. Like it's, without reading it, it's pretty obvious that it could be a good idea to be able to categorize or rank or something. So it can actually build fairly sophisticated stuff. And we're expanding this technology to be able to do like case studies. I think this one even has case studies. Somewhere I think I saw case studies here. So I think this is all good, but this is not enough. Like this is not a learning program yet. This is all the stuff that a publisher used to have after they had spent tons of time on it. So why did they originally hire somebody like us to help? That's to do the next part here. And I've done a little bit of like Jamie Oliver cooking here. So I prepared a module so that you could see what it would look like in the program. So here you can see that. So here is a ebook where there is highlighted stuff. Works the same way as the adaptive ebooks that we've been doing in the past. The questions work exactly the same way. So in essence, this is a totally fully integrated product already. And I've done no editing of this at all. It has basically, you can basically have a first thing here you can try out. And I have no idea what this means. But here you see here, there are all the different ways I can learn more about this. And it will pull up a slide here. A bit of formatting we probably should fix more generally here. And it's even narrated. You can probably not hear.
We can't hear the sound.
But it's narrated by another kind of AI, which is something we've used for many years, where we automatically do speech synthesis. So this is a good example of at least three different kinds of AI deployed at the same time.
A lot of reaction from the room minds being slightly blown, as you said earlier. Also, Jay Haynes saying, look, it's great. Who lost their job or who wasn't employed as a result of doing this? So, I mean, it's a fair question, isn't it?
That's a very fair question, because we have ourselves had lots of academic learning engineers hired to do trivial work. They usually have been hired for relatively short amounts of time. So what we are going to see is that they will be doing a different job in the future. They will be doing the higher order thinking, because what's more fun? Go to work and try to come up with distractors, or go to work and try to figure out how do we now build the sophisticated components on top of what we have here? Because MindFlow can actually even help with writing interactives or more complicated things, and that will be the role of the people with brains in the future, to put things on top of this. This is all the trivial work is now done. Now we can get to the kinds of higher order thinking, because this is not getting you to higher order thinking. I want to be very clear about this. This is the table stakes stuff that is necessary to establish meaningful environments where you can learn or get to higher order thinking. And that's where the learning engineers and the instructional designers will be spending their jobs in the future. Those jobs where they were being wasted where they wasted their talents on generating mindless distractors for multiple choice questions or copy editing or inserting pictures, that will not happen. And the interesting thing is, so it's being bimodal now. We're right now hiring dozens of people in low wage areas to basically mark up existing stuff. So really, really trivial stuff that AI cannot do. The meaning of which column, in a text combines where, that kind of stuff. And at the other end, I think we are in a very targeted fashion upgrading the skill sets of our learning engineers to do the things on top of it. But the big bulk in the middle will change a lot.
I think we could have a long discussion about jobs in the future. I don't want to talk about that right now, not because it's not important, but simply because there are so many things we could talk about. And I think probably now it would be great to probably just very quickly, because this is the right point, discuss what the future for learning development profession is here, and then go into Q&A. So, Ulrik, I've said for a long time people should stop writing courses. It's not quite right. I mean, stop writing courses about generic stuff. There's lots of content out there. Clearly, it is now possible for us to be generating rather than writing courses which are extremely sophisticated. They may or may not be engaging. So there's a question from Ruth about making stuff engaging. I think that's important. But what is going to be different about the role of learning and development in the future, given because you've been deeply involved with this for years, what's your view about how things are going to change for L&D? And then I'm going to throw my 2 cents in. Ulrik.
So I think the engaging part is important. Like just being passive consumers of somebody communicating something to you is disengaging. The fact that you're actually able to underway show that you and test yourself that you've learned it in a very granular fashion has typically been the thing that I think the secret sauce to making things engaging. Not engaging Hollywood style engaging or Game Boy engaging. Like we cannot compete with that in learning and development. But if people have a need to learn something, it's way more engaging if you actually can feel and can demonstrate proficiency. So I think that's one part. And I think the higher order thinking part, the higher order thinking components are going to be critically important as well. So the engaging part is definitely important, but I also think that the demonstrable skills, the fact that you can demonstrate mastery after you've learned something is a key part of what the future of L&D is, as opposed to the commitment-based thing where you showed up, you went for a course for 2 days, and people assume that you've learned something because you've been there.
So many good comments coming through. Milcha is saying, with people having an attention span of about 15 seconds, how are we going to get people to higher order thinking? That's another question to be asked. And Roger, really interesting. I used to develop, I think he's got a point here. I used to develop children's educational games for floppy disks and CD-ROMs in the 1990s. And then somebody turned on the internet and killed that industry. This is another of those moments. Now, I think it is another moment of those moments in terms of it being transformative. I don't think it's another one of those moments in terms of people losing jobs wholesale. I think there's going to be less work producing content. I think there's also going to be, unfortunately, an explosion of mediocre content. I think generative AI is simply going to mean lots of bad, dull, grey stuff coming out with snazzy pictures attached, which, to your point, Ruth, is not engaging and isn't actually helping people learn. I think we're going to have a bunch of new skills which L&D will pick up on, which will help us create stuff which is much more targeted and will use tools to help people learn what they need to learn better. And I think for me, learning engagement starts with people really wanting to learn something. So if we can target what people want and what they need and don't give them the stuff that is superfluous, get them to where they want to get to either now for an immediate gain or for long-term career development. If we can help with that, and AI tools can certainly help us do that, then we are doing our jobs better in L&D. The question is, what do we need to do that? Well, it's not content generation, it's performance consulting, maybe, as Ulrik's talked about, prompt engineering. We also need to talk about understanding ethics and the problems around data. So there's a lot more for L&D to be doing. Here's the thing, this stuff is powerful. If we don't do it, somebody else will. Somebody else in the organization is going to be using this stuff and they won't understand about learning. So for goodness sake, let us seize the bull by the horns and take a leading position here. I'm very excited about all this, as you can tell. Lots of chat still coming through. I'm going to just jump to our Q&A section here. On the left-hand side, we can see the QR code. That's going to take you through to the a place you can learn more about MindFlow and other stuff that Ulrik's doing in Area 9. You can also connect with Ulrik via LinkedIn, and the URLs are in the box on the left-hand side. People are asking about the cost of MindFlow. I know we've got Niels here in the background. It's more than once that's come up. So Niels, if you're there, could you possibly answer the question about the cost of MindFlow? I'm not adequately versed. Okay, go on.
I'll answer it for Niels, which is we don't know yet. This is research. We're basically giving you a sneak peek into like the craziest part of our research lab. We're using this for some really high-end projects right now. We've just released hundreds of products with a publisher in the US in the school space. So we don't know yet, honestly. We're only doing like special projects with friends of the house because it is. I don't know why they called it mind flow. I've proposed a very similar word for it, but it is truly like incredible what it does. So we don't know yet. We are implementing a simpler version though in all of our bridge tools. All of the tools we use to ingest existing content and work for quickly drafting content yourself, that will be that is already, I think it is for some of our clients, they have that. But that's more the ad hoc help, because that of course it also helps if you have educational expertise when you're trying to do something and say, can you help me generate some distractors for this? Like, it's highly qualified what comes out of it. Or I have this text, what should I do with it? This piece of text here, what should I do with it? So the more like smaller parts is going to be implemented in the standard product.
We've got 8 minutes before we have to wrap up. In fact, 8 minutes before we have to end. Probably 7 minutes before we have to wrap up.
Don, there was an interesting one from Dale where he said, highly gamified learning doesn't have an impact. And I couldn't agree more. We've been looking for that impact for years, trying to figure out whether we could use that to drive that motivation. And we've had a top game designer on our top team for several years, and we simply haven't been able to find that impact. And I come to the conclusion that the thing that makes it meaningful and motivating for adults is it needs to be real in their life. And some pixels on the screen that gives you a badge is not real. If it's something that gives you admiration among your colleagues, that's a different thing. So you need to find a way where badges, credits, whatever you call them, actually has meaning for adults. Not the now you have a virtual CD player for your Barbie doll on the screen. That's not going to work.
Sorry.
Or let's pretend we're on the golf course, and for every white one, you're moving the ball forward. Adults don't buy that.
No. Lots of great links coming. I'm trying to paste some of those to the left-hand side. Andrew, perhaps if you could find good ones and paste them over as well, that would be super. Don't want these great resources people are throwing in to get lost. Let's deal very quickly with the copyright issue. That's a big one. What can you tell us quickly? Because we know ChatGPT has sourced publicly available stuff, but not all of some of it's in copyright. How do you make sure you're not transgressing copyright rules, not just with Mindflow, but generally using generative AI?
So the thing is, it is written de novo. So the copyright is actually the other way around. The bigger problem is you cannot copyright what you're doing with ChatGPT or GPT-4. You're not possessing, you're not owning the copyright for what you're doing afterwards, and you cannot claim that. So the way they have built the large language models actually protects you against that. There will be lots of lawsuits where somebody will try to see if they can attack these large guys. But as a point of departure, leave that fight to the OpenAI companies of the world, and as long as you're using it on their license terms, we believe you're pretty protected.
Great question from Mark.
The problem is you cannot copyright what you're doing with it. That's the much more important discussion, I think.
Okay. A question from Mark. A great session. Will there be follow-up of some sort, sharing of links? This is a question for Chloe. If you could just drop a note in the presenter chat. Are we going to be able to find some way to put the links and some of the thoughts in a text edition on the archive? If not, let me know. We'll find somewhere. Andrew Jacobs is going to do a blog on this tomorrow. That's perfect, Andrew. Thank you very much. Okay. Now, Harriet's saying, Ulrik, you can't copyright what you're doing. Can you sell it? You can sell it, but
you can package it and sell it, but somebody would be able to grab stuff of it like ruthlessly and try to do something similar. And that's also why the stuff that comes out of, for instance, Mindflow in itself cannot be seen as a new business venture. What is important is what you do with it. And that's a totally different game. Because what if you suddenly, as a large corporation, was able to have completely curated content in all the major L&D fields, all with examples from your industry, from your company, and nobody has access to copying it anyway. So that it doesn't matter. Then it does have the impact you're looking for. But we have to rethink what is IP value. And it can just as well be that the stuff that you have done with it that brings value to your organization, as opposed to going out and selling at scale. I think the content aggregators will really have to think about their future, whether they're
Yeah.
publishers or content aggregators in other ways, because they will have if they have a bigger problem. You saw what happened with one of the largest and one of the hottest higher education organizations, Czech. Their stock price dropped like a rock, because it was pretty obvious that that kind of aggregation would be challenged.
Regulation, do you think, because of the EU AI Act and GDPR, we in the EU are going to be perpetually lagging behind the US and possibly even Japan, which has taken an even more laissez-faire view of AI? What's your view on the regulation side, Ulrik?
Yeah, well, so the commissioner is Danish, so I'm flying the Danish flag, and I do think that I think we need to think about it in another way. There will always be countries in the world who are way more ruthless than we are. Look at the other areas that we're regulating, whether it's the military, whether it's gene modification, whether it's a number of these different things, whether it's human rights or trying medicine on patients. There are lots of areas where we could fear we're falling behind. I think the combination of morality, ethics, science, and legislation to protect ourselves and each other is a more powerful combination than just being ruthless. So I believe in democracy and doing things the right way.
Thank you for that answer.
But I will have to say, we are a lot of organizations and experts who are trying to provide input to don't get stupid. Like at some of that first draft that came out about regulating AI, any kind of math calculation would be included. And the other thing is, it looks like education will be considered high risk.
Right. Leo made a point earlier about so much in our lives and our thinking and our value coming from creative, putting together serendipitously of things that otherwise might not be associated. Is there a risk that if we use AI too much, we lose that free-flowing, free-thinking approach to the world?
100%. We absolutely have to, like, our role in the future is to not do that, to be the guarantee that we're not just whatever anybody else can find on the internet or on ChatGPT. So absolutely, there is a risk.
Okay, we've got one last question, time for that, from Serena. What are your thoughts about the connections, if there are any, between AI and emotional intelligence? Is there no emotional intelligence? There was famously, the New York Times journalist said that either ChatGPT had fallen in love with him or he'd fallen in love with it. It was a bit creepy. Is there a link? Do we need to be concerned, or are we anthropomorphizing too much?
Yeah, I think we are doing that too much. I can't even say the word. But I think we are doing that. But I think that there is a much more positive impact of it. So let's say that you are trying to engage learners in complex things that eventually should lead to social emotional intelligence or personal interpersonal skills, whatever you call them. And instead of alienating them by some really poorly written material, it's super hard to get to if you're able to and you can make it a lot more humanistic in the way it's written. Like, we're rewriting stuff that has been recurated, that has been written many times before, and people think, oh, this is state of the art. And you say, how about this? And people are like, wow, that's much better, much easier to read. So I think that if we remove some of the stupid obstacles in the current education system, it might be easier to get to whatever we call it. Social emotional learning has been bastardized lately by a certain part of the political spectrum in the US. But whatever we call these personal and interpersonal skills we need to develop. And I think that will actually be easier with this.
I want to say thank you very much to Ulrik Christensen of Area 9. I would recommend getting in touch with him. His URL for his LinkedIn profile is on the left-hand side there. I would also like to say thank you very much to Andrew Jacobs, who's been in the background doing a fabulous juggling act with all of your comments. And of course, a thank you to everybody in this room. You've done a fabulous job of, wow, sharing such great ideas, such great thinking, so much to think about here. I'm sure we'll have people coming back to the recording. There will also be blogs about this on the Learning Technology site and also on Andrew Jacobs' own site as well. I might do something myself because there's so much rich content that everybody's generated here. Thank you so much. I want to leave you with one thought. I remember in 1978, I watched a program on the BBC, Horizon program, called The Chips Are Down. It was a seminal moment in the history of IT in the UK. It finished with the words. It was about how computers were going to change the future. We've reached the point now which it was talking about, and we've gone through a lot of transformations away from manufacturing sector to a services sector to an even more sophisticated services sector. It finished with the words, "It's time to think about the future." I think we can say the same thing now. It's time to think about the future. Ulrik, everybody, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.